Welcome to another Unwinding with Fiber and Fabric. Today I have 2 finished quilts, 1 new quilt block, some quilting history, and some wool fluff. But before we dive into that, let me just welcome you to my channel, welcome you to this video. For those of you that have been following me for a while, you know that I cover a wide range of crafts because, of course, like many crafters, I like to dabble with a number of different fiber-related, fabric-related hobbies. So, depending on the week, depending on the month and how I'm feeling, we may have spinning, we may have crochet, knitting, definitely quilting, because I've been doing a lot of quilting lately. So I welcome you, whether you are new to the channel or you're returning. And now let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to start today with what I know a number of you have been waiting to hear about. I have selected my Tour de Fleece fiber. For those of you who are not familiar with Tour de Fleece is a spinning event that runs alongside the Tour de France each year. And it is, you can find it on Ravelry. You can also find it on Facebook. And I believe a few of the other social networking have Tour de Fleece chats. So my Tour de Fleece, and pardon me as I watch my cats, of course. So those of you that watch me all the time know that I have 4 cats that live inside with me, and they are always causing trouble the minute I turn on the camera. They can be calm and quiet and asleep, but the minute I'm talking to the camera, they decide they need to be the center of my attention. I also now have a few other critters that distract me at times while I'm recording videos and otherwise. I have 2 cats, 2 strays that are both feral that have claimed my backyard as their home. And we started feeding them, this winter because they were looking a little rough. So I have 2 feral cats in my backyard. They both, they do seem to, at least one of them, the female, seems to have been part of a catch and release program that I know some areas have, where the community will catch them, sterilize them so they won't continue to breed, and then release them back where they were initially picked up. So I have 1 female cat in the backyard, and she is about the same size as my 2 younger cats. And believe it or not, with a sliding glass door between them, they have become part of the same pride of cats. I only have 1 of my 4 cats inside that is not happy about this arrangement. She is very unhappy, but the other 3 are delighted to have an extra member of their pride who comes and says hi to them at the window every day. In addition, I have another feral cat. He's a little bit different. Not sure if he is been sterilized or not. He definitely tends to, I think, romp further and more wide. But we seem to be willing to take in anybody who wants to come and eat at the porch, because we also have a raccoon that has made his presence known in these last month or so. So we're very careful about how we feed the cats and when we feed the cats to try to avoid any further encroachment of nature. But the raccoon's not causing us any trouble, so he's just kind of fun to occasionally watch. And I'm sure I've shown pictures of the ones that I have pictures of. My the 2 cats are a little harder to get photos of. They're, as I said, they're a little jittery around when my husband and I are moving around, although they have begun to relax a little bit. So, okay, nice little tangent, and in that time, my indoor cats have kind I've started to settle down a little bit and not as much of a distraction. So as I was saying, Tour de Fleece is an event that we do each year as a fun way to interact with each other as spinners. We make personal goals. Some of us join teams. It is not a competition per se. It is about sharing in and spreading the love of hand spinning. And this year, I've decided to go with, this is a Romney fleece from a Romney sheep. And I am going to, it is about, I've pulled out and cleaned up about 1.5 pounds of fiber. And I'm going to separate it into probably 1 ounce clumps and dye each 1 ounce clump a different color and spin it every day, every other day of Tour de Fleece. So that is my main project. I may add in little challenges or some variety as the event progresses. But we also have the Olympics coming up in August, and on Ravelry, there's always a thing that's called the Ravelanic games that we do, that another way to get together as a community and just have fun with our fiber arts. And so I may be saving some of the playing around for that event in that almost directly follows the Tour de Fleece this year. So I have the fiber. It's been scoured. I will probably, my goal, I think, and what I like to do, so here's the staple length of a lock. It's a nice, rather long, medium to long lock, and it's got some good crimp. It's not the finest next to skin necessarily, but it isn't, you know, terrible. This specific fleece isn't terribly scratchy either. I don't really have an end project in mind. I'm more of a spin. But one of the things that I did think about doing, what I think and what inspired me to pick this specific fleece, as opposed to one of my finer, softer fleeces or longer, coarser fleeces, is I want to try to spin this for its end purpose to be used as a thick embroidery wool. So that is my goal. I have some spun little sample pieces that that were spun by Colonial Williamsburg, that is used in their, you know, some of their hand embroidery projects. And so I'm going to try to match that kind of gauge. That's the goal, at least. So I picked something that is a bit of a longer staple length, maybe a little bit coarser, but it should spin really well. I should still be able to get the fineness that I'm looking for this specific type of embroidery floss. It will be a 2-ply. So I will separate everything into 1 ounce bundles. Then I will split those into 1/2 ounce bundles, and I will spin those together. I may decide to just keep it all together in a 1 ounce group, and then ply it from a center pull ball. It shouldn't mess up my twist too much. I don't have a big problem with that technique. So stay tuned. As this month progresses, I will share the dyeing, hopefully, or at least the progress as I go. And certainly as we enter the end of June and the early part of July, you'll start seeing Tour de Fleece, very specific videos, in addition to this longer, more podcast-like video that I do. So that is my woolly fluff. And so far, I'm trying to limit myself to that for this month of spinning that is coming up. All right, next, if you have been watching my more recent videos, you will know that I just finally broke down, as I laugh and say, I've gone to the dark side, and I have purchased a long arm quilting machine. My husband even made a little video, a little recording of me trying out the machine on this large quilt that I'm about to share. I also have video of him doing a little stitching on this quilt as well. We're in the learning phase. There is a freedom of exploration that is going on. But the quilt that I have to share, the first quilt that I have to share today, is a whole cloth quilt, meaning the top of the quilt is made from one piece of fabric that I have tie-dyed. And then I have made the quilt sandwich with the top, the batting, and a backing, and I have machine quilted it to hold that sandwich together. So, overall, I am really pleased with this. This is the largest piece of fabric that I have tie-dyed in this nature. I used to, years ago, do a little dabbling with dyeing sheets, but the technique, I was usually just using one color, scrunching it all up and letting the color get absorbed as it will. I have certainly dyed a lot of different large pieces of fabric that then would get cut up, etc. for quilts. But this is the first time I have done a whole cloth quilt this large. This quilt finishes out at about, it's probably 107 inches, 106, 107 inches. Taking into consideration shrinkage and such, it's probably 106 by 106 inch quilt. It is machine quilted on my long arm quilting machine, which technically mine I think is called more of a mid arm. It's not as big and big of quilting area as the more traditional long arms. And I just did an overall kind of meander. But after I did a few, I guess you might say rows across of doing a meander, what I really wanted to be able to do was follow a little bit of the tie-dyed design. I wanted to be able to use the stitches to try to highlight the valleys, the color changes, the shapes that the tie-dyeing process created. So, as with most new things that I try, rather than just playing it safe, I dove right in and I did a lot of rolling the fabric forward or rolling the quilt forward and rolling the quilt back and maneuvering to try to maneuver around the shapes, especially if you look at the picture. There's kind of a center area that I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just putting stitches across without some thought of that shape, that bold kind of center of the quilt. So I have a lot left to learn. I am just barely starting out, but I was really pleased with, we figured out how to get it loaded on the quilt frame. And yes, having so many decades of quilting by hand and and piecing with a machine and doing a little dabbling with some free motion quilting, and having made a few small baby size quilts with this new machine. Having all that experience definitely made it so I was a little more comfortable. There's a lot of wonderful techniques and styles that I can't wait to try. But I need this quilt for something that's coming up in about a month. I needed this quilt, so I dove in. And you can see the kind of meander the moving around, trying to move around the color variations in it. No, I cannot lift this up in front of the camera. That's why the still pictures are so important. Oh my goodness. It is heavy, but it is heavy in the sense that it is just a lot of fabric. It's not a thick quilt. It's not a fluffy quilt. And that's the other thing with the machine quilting. One of the things that when you look at a lot of really wonderful high artistic level machine quilting, you'll see oftentimes it's much more dense stitching than this. One of the things I wanted to avoid with a lot of my quilts is I see the purpose of dense stitching at times in different things, and I do like it more for, say, wall hangings and such. But for me, a bed quilt, a quilt that you're supposed to you want to, you know, crumple yourself up into, you know, just, I guess, crumple around you. That kind of quilt to me needs to have the air pockets. It needs to have the areas, that in essence have no stitching. That is a pocket of air. It's a pillow of air. And that pillow of air is what helps insulate us. Whether it's insulating us from the cold outside, or actually sometimes even insulating us from the heat, it helps insulate by having that pocket of air. So that was important. That was very important for me when I wanted to get into this, when I wanted to try this, that I could create something that left more pockets of air. So the other thing with this is, I know from years of quilting, it's important to try to keep your quilting balanced across the quilt. You do not want areas that have huge expanses that aren't quilted and areas that are densely quilted, unless it's a specific look you're going for artistically. You want to avoid it. You want to have a balance of quilting across your piece. So that was the other challenge, is trying to make sure that how I quilted it at the beginning is also how I was quilting it at the end. And I was a lot more open and free in the center section than I was at the top and the bottom. So I can see what the top and the bottom is. I think my husband can as well, because I had him give it a try, and he hadn't played on the machine at all. So his one pass of quilting that he contributed, his natural flair was certainly there, but the finesse of understanding the speed wasn't. So we can see his stitching versus my stitching, the top versus the bottom, and that's wonderful. This this quilt does have a label. I will probably mention more about it later, but its purpose, who it's going to, all of that is still, it's still being kept quiet-ish. So that is my whole cloth quilt, my tie-dyed. I will tell you, I absolutely loved doing this quilt. So expect a little more tie-dye in the upcoming months, because I want to practice some more techniques. I want to try some different tie-dye techniques on the larger fabric, because it is very different when you're maneuvering such a large piece of cloth versus when it's a shirt or a smaller piece of cloth. So I'm planning to do maybe some throw quilt size, twin quilt size quilts that are just going to go into the stash, I guess you could say. I am tossing around the idea of possibly selling a couple of them if people are interested in them, letting them go. My family and I, we've chuckled right now, and especially because of having the long arm, we are good on quilts. And that leads me to the next quilt. because this is one of the mystery quilts that we did about 14 years ago. And I mentioned this before. I've shared one before. So about 14 years ago, there was a quilt group that we belonged to that was going to do a mystery quilt. And the concept of a mystery quilt is you get a clue, instruction clue, every week, every month, something of that nature. And when you get the clue, then you make that piece of the quilt. And you don't know what the final thing is going to look like. You don't know, you're given very specific like types of fabrics that would work better than others, things to avoid, but then you just go along. And so my kids and I decided we were going to do that, and they each picked fabrics for their quilt, and then I picked fabrics to make a quilt for each one of them. I have finished hand quilting, and we made the tops, so, you know, all those years ago. And we actually looked at getting a long arm quilting machine at that time, but we didn't. I have since finally quilted my son's, I think it was last year, my son's quilt. And now I have finished quilting my daughter's quilt. And I decided to quilt them by hand because, of course, I didn't have a long arm quilting machine. And doing free motion quilting on a standard machine is just physically too much for me. I can get through sewing on half, you know, part of the binding, you know, and then I sew the second half of the binding down by hand. So that I do struggle a little bit with, especially with larger quilts at the machine. The machine sewing isn't my favorite part of quilting. I like the designing. I love the hand quilting of it. I'm now enjoying the hand piecing that I'm getting with English paper piecing. But, so I now have 2 of the 4 mystery quilts finished. But I can't really decide if I want to do the final 2 by hand or if I want to do the final 2 on the long arm. And so I'm kind of tossing it around. And one of the big things is I already have the final 2 basted so that it's attached together. And to the long arm, you don't need it basted. And so I'm kind of not really sure. Plus, when I was quilting my son's, this is the pattern for this mystery quilt. I'll just flat out say, I was not thrilled. And it's not just a case of not knowing what we were making ahead of time. It's about when I design my own quilts, I'm very conscientious. I'm very aware of the symmetricalness, the symmetry. And while I have no problem with asymmetry, to me, asymmetry is a planned thing, not, well, this is just how this many rows of blocks end up looking. And so the overall idea of this quilt, I like. The way it works out because it's a mystery quilt and because you're not really planning out all the pieces, that kind of bugged me. My personal preference. So if I show the picture here, you'll notice that there's the intertwining yellow and teal squares. There's a piece that's random missing on one end and an unfinished chain on the other. And my brain says if I were designing this to make this for myself, I would have calculated and adjusted the blocks to where you had finished chains all the way around. And it is doable. It's just not doable if you are trying to keep the number of segments that you're making simple to go with a mystery quilt. So I understand why it turned out this way, but there's a part of the designer part of my brain is like, that's not how I would do it if I designed it myself. However, I've now quilted my son's, and And I got it done, but there was something about it that it just still wasn't feeling the flow. Quilting this one for my daughter, I purchased a different ruler, and it's a ruler that's actually designed to be used with a long arm quilting machine rather than, you know, just as a standard ruler, but it is one that does that kind of squiggly line. Now, I have other rulers and things like that that can do similar things, but this one was just the right specifications, I guess you could say, to really do that cross section. And with that, I all of a sudden found myself loving the process of quilting this one more. The other thing I ran into with this is I didn't know how to finish the center of this big open space. Remember, as I said just a bit ago, it's important to try to keep your quilting similar spacing all the way across in order to have the stability and for the quilt to just lie better on the bed, to wash better, to look better overall. What I decided to do, I waited until I had finished quilting everything else before I tackled these large blue squares. And then using, again, this time the templates that I'm using are designed for a router. So a thick plexiglass template to cut out circles designed to be used with a router rather than quilting. So woodworking. And if you can see there, there's multiple circles because it has multiple, this set that I bought had multiple of these cut out circles. And so I did circles in that. And oh my goodness, all of a sudden, what frustrated me a little bit in quilting my sons was gone. And I quilted, well, I didn't start quilting on this one until I finished the sampler pack quilt that I'm pretty sure I showed you in April. I wasn't really paying much attention, but yeah, I quilted this up pretty quickly. And so this would be, I would say you'd probably call it a double. So I think it's like 65 by 70-ish inches, something like that. I can't remember the numbers. I measured it all and multiplied it all to figure out the binding, but I can't remember. So I do need to take a lint roller to this one. This is covered in fluff, but I also, in the border, use that same wavy ruler and I put that wave. So it is much like I was showing you that one. It is quilted, but it is still a lot of air pockets. Let me show you on the back so you can see on the back. It has the air, it has the denser, that's showing you the, let's see, and now you can see, there we go. That's a good angle there. So you can see, trying to keep a similar quilting density all across the quilt. So that is quilt number 2. And I'm so pleased. The combination of doing hand quilting, slow stitching, slow crafting, coupled now with a higher speed, faster way of finishing something that I've started on. I'm glad that I took the leap. I'm still adjusting. I still have a lot to learn. The wonderful machine quilters out there that people go to for their competition quilts and all that, I'm in awe of the work that they do. To be clear, machine quilting is a art technique of its own. It's a skill of its own. I am a traditionalist when it comes to so much of what I do because I enjoy the process, not because I think one is better than the other. I do enjoy the process. And I am a bit finicky. I will admit, I am a little biased when it comes to the finished product. By no means am I a perfectionist. By no means will I sit and unpick and unpick and unpick because of a small flaw. I am all about the structure, and I'm about the structure and doing it to a quality that makes it something that holds up over time and is aesthetically pleasing to the person using it. Okay. With that being said, one of the reasons I also, besides physically being just really difficult for me, one of the reasons I have not enjoyed machine quilting on a domestic machine is I too often see the quilts get puckers, get folds. And that happens, okay? I was doing a practice one and I ended up, getting a nice little, pucker crease. And you can always unpick, etc. But one of the things that with me when I'm finishing a quilt is I take the quilt and I baste it on a frame. So that when I'm sitting down and I'm hand quilting, even if whether I'm using a hoop or not using a hoop, it has been basted. It has been, the sandwich has been held together, and there's less shifting and less chance of a tuck and a fold, a big wrinkle on the backside. And everyone said, well, it's the backside. Why you're going to look at it? For me, it's not just a matter of looking at it. You can, if it's something, to me, I feel it, I notice it there, and it can bug at me. And I'm beginning to understand that that is something that is not me just being nitpicky, but it is actually something that is to do with how it affects how it feels on my skin, how it picks at my brain if I'm sitting there under a quilt and I can feel something that is off. My brain goes, ugh, and I can't do it. And as I have gotten older, I have become, well, and as the world has become more open and accepting of differences, I have come to understand that what my brain's doing and the way I'm reacting is due to the way I'm put together. And not everyone out there is going to be bugged by it. And so I'm trying to learn how to be less annoyed when I see quilts that have these, what I consider major flaws, because they are not a major flaw to someone else. They may not, if they are not causing a structural lack of integrity to the quilt, if they aren't bothering the person who is wrapped up in it, then I guess it's not a flaw. And that's what I'm trying to embrace. That's where I'm trying to go as getting older, is I'm becoming aware that some of the things that make my brain work the way it does are completely different from others. And maybe, I don't know if it's different from the majority, it's just different. And so I'm trying to embrace what quilting has always been about me for me in a broader spectrum. If it is structurally sound, if you're not going to get fingers and toes caught in the threads or in a loose seam or something, if it's structurally sound, if it's not going to catch on things in a way that would cause damage to it or little fingers and toes, then use it and love it and share it. But I'm also the kind of person who I encourage people to search out ways to improve, Not for the seeking to have it perfect, because that's a lifetime. And just as soon as you think that you have mastered something, someone's going to come along with a new technique or trick that's going to challenge you and throw you into the deep end, starting all over again, learning how to swim. So it's about, though, learning for the joy of learning and progressing so that we feel greater satisfaction in the aesthetic, the artistry, the craft, the skill, so that when we sit down to do something, we can create what it is we see, what we want to, with the minimal amount of interference. That, to me, is what it's about. That is what the goal is. It's not about some arbitrary definition of perfect or some judge's idea of what a quilt should look like or be constructed at. It's about having the skills to create what's in our head into something that we can touch with our hands. And to do it with the minimal amount of frustration and difficulty, because we have practiced, because we have built the skill. We have, and even if you do not feel like you have any artistic ability at all, having the skill to do something well is an art in itself. Now, there are a ton of things that I am never going to be skilled in, partly because of physical limitations and partly because of no desire whatsoever to become skilled in them. But the things that I do dabble with, I like to be proficient enough to be able to create what I want to create when I want to create it. And that brings me to the quilt history and the block. So this block is not part of my EPP series that I've been doing these last like 6 months. This is one that was inspired when I ended up getting a new used book. It's one that I've been wanting to look at for a while. Specifically, I loved the facts and fabrications. One of the things with quilt history is regional. It is like a lot of history. It can be biased and very specific to this type of area of history. Clear, concise, precise record and data can sometimes be hard to find, even in a modern day where you have a click of the button resources. The other thing that, much like history, is that you can get myth blended in with history. And the myth is important. When we talk about the history of quilting, we have to remember you have the category of oral history. You have a category of the physical textile history, an actual quilt that is dated to a specific time. We can look at those things. But what you also have is a great deal of story. And story has value, but story also is intermingled with a great deal of bias. We want to tell a good story. We want to share a good story. We want to share a point, a moral, a lesson. And so we have to be very careful when we talk about quilt history, especially here in the United States. We have to address the fact that a great deal of what we take as history, facts of our quilts, was actually kind of invented at the beginning of the last century. That is not to say there is not truth to the stories. That is not to say there is not facts embedded in the stories and the myths. What it is to say is we have to remember it's more of a fable. It's more of quilt lore, not necessarily hard history. So this book came because I was very curious as to how, so Barbara Brackman is She's a wonderful contributor to the quilting world. She spent a huge amount of time compiling quilt blocks, and you can find, if you look her up, you can find she has, and they finally republished it with some more color in it. It was, for a while, the only way you could find it was used, and even then it was very expensive to find. But she has a book that is a collection of quilt blocks. Fabulous. I think it's like Encyclopedia of Quilt Blocks, something like, and by Barbara Brackman. I'll put links in the description below for these resources. And it's wonderful. It is where I go to when I'm trying to find out if there is a name to a block. A lot of the blocks that I have shared in these last 6 months, they come from looking at the pictures that she has shared. They have, some of them have 20 different names. Some of them have no names. When I got this book, I was thumbing through it, and I found a block that I really wanted to try. And I wanted to try it because I love windmills. I love windmill blocks. It's something that I started to gravitate to when I married my husband. His mother loved everything to do with Dutch heritage, because that was her heritage. And so there was windmills present. And so when I found this block, which is just called a charm block, I wanted to be able to do it and to share it. The reason I like this is twofold. One, it is a single piece block, as in it's one. In fact, I think it is one patch, much like the rest of the EPP that we're doing. Okay. And then when you flip it over, you have the other patch. Okay. So it's one patch that makes a component that gets sewn together. And what I love about it, I have drawn it here. You can make it any size you want. If you want to make your own template, it's really simple. Make yourself a square. Then measure in from one side a very specific amount, whichever that you want, and do the same thing from this side. From that point to that point, draw a line, cut it in half. Now you have two of the same template. So it is a very, very easy patch to do a single patch block. And of course, I went with the windmill configuration. But you can take this patch and you can put it into, you can have them all lined up. You can play with them. So I really liked this. I liked it for the fact that it was a windmill. A number of blocks that look a bit like windmills, or in the past have been called windmill type blades and blocks. Unfortunately, they visually look a little too much like a symbol that was co-opted by by Germany in World War II. So trying to not say specific words that might trigger censors. So a lot of the blocks that we find that represent windmills and mills or water wheels and those things of the past, unfortunately, no matter what color variation we put them in, they have a tendency to cause people to associate them, to see that symbol. And that's really sad, because the symbol meant a lot of other things long before the early to mid 20th century. So that's why I liked this one, because this block is a little less of that. But as I was making these, and each one of these are a little bit different in size, as I was making these, I still kind of felt like if I'm going to hold this up to a camera, it could still be maybe triggering. So I put a couple circles in the center. And then as soon as I put the circles in the center, I started to see another flag from the same war. And I had to look it up and go, oh, no. So it is a windmill block. I hope that it does not, you know, seem to associate with anything that it should not associate with. I wanted to try to come up with a way to do it, to use this block to have a windmill, because I think windmills are both historically and modern days important. So it's just 2 applique circles in the center, and this one is done English paper piecing, which I have to tell you is still much more enjoyable. These are done on the sewing machine. They definitely can be done on the sewing machine. There is a trick in how you overlap them in order to have little dog ears on the end so that the seams match up. But here's the thing, if you decide to do it on the sewing machine and all of a sudden you've sewn it together and it's got a little wonky edge, just trim them. Because as you can see, you don't really notice too much if my pieces aren't exactly the same. And that's the other thing I really love about this one. I do know that when I trimmed this one up, I made a mistake in how I was trimming it. And if we were to measure, we would see that they are not the same width anymore. So I really do like this block because it can be done different ways, and it's quite friendly. You can trim it down. You can trim it to make it a consistent size. The one that I did for the English paper piecing, and I will share that pattern, it finishes as a 12-inch block. I could trim it down. As long as you trim equally around each side, you can trim it down to whatever size you want. And it will still be fine. It will still look like you wanted to have it look. And consistency across every block is what you can do. So I will share this, but really quickly before I leave, I wanted to share you some quilt lore very specifically about this type of block. In Barbara Brackman's book, she calls it charm. Okay, now what she means by charm is, and I will have a link if you want to read a lot more about charm quilts. These are quilts that are not simply made from charm packs that you can buy today. There is a historical piece to it. Young women would collect buttons and string them together to make charm, in essence, bracelets, charm strings. And the idea was that you collected all these buttons, these individually different buttons, and you had these charm strings, and you were supposed to, in essence, meet your Prince Charming, meet your, true love before you had collected 1,000 buttons. From that became charm quilts. Quilters took it. Every piece of the quilt was made with a different fabric. So you can imagine the swapping, kind of like baseball cards and things of that nature that people, would collect and swap of the 20th century. In the 19th century, think of young quilters swapping pieces of fabric so that no two fabrics in their quilt would match, and the time that it would take and the fun that they would have getting little scraps of fabric from their friends and community. Moving into the 20th century, late 19th century into the 20th century, fabric companies discovered, well, let's just sell them charm packs. A pack of blocks, every single one of them different. And we can still buy those today, charm packs. But the charm quilt originated from this idea of every single block being different. As opposed to a scrappy quilt, and I have a bin of scrappy, scrappy little squares that I will someday sew together. A scrappy quilt, depending on its size, could be considered like a postage stamp quilt. Little and tiny, itty-bitty pieces sewn together. Or a single, because in essence, in this case, it is a single piece quilt, like a hexagon quilt. It's just a square. In a scrappy quilt of that nature, you're not worried if you have multiple of the same fabric. But in these charm quilts, the goal was to not have two that were the same. So I will put in the description below links to the book, but also I found an article called Yesterday's and Today's Charm Quilts by Sherry Quilts a lot. She has a blog post. I will share the link to that so that you can read about the history of charm quilts as well. And I think with that, I am going to wrap up and say, have a wonderful unwinding with fiber and fabric, and we will see you in June, in which I do have another surprise project I'm working on that I hope to welcome in June with in a couple weeks. So until then, happy unwinding with fiber and fabric, and we'll see you soon.